Hi, welcome to the channel. Today's video is titled How the American Civil War Happened, Road to the War. This is interesting. We're going to check this video together, and I love your thoughts and your contribution in the comments below. Let's dive right in.
The American Civil War only became inevitable after American leaders repeatedly failed to defuse the tensions. Indeed, the deadliest war in American history was not a foregone conclusion, but short-sighted deals, ineffective compromises, and indifference allowed tensions to simmer until they boiled over. Despite early action against slavery, America's founders chose to let slavery die out naturally rather than outright kill it. During their time, the idea that slavery would revive and grow stronger was unfathomable to them. However, the younger generations of plantation owners never realized that their paranoid need to protect slavery was creating the very opposition they sought to smother. Ultimately, a combination of arrogance, mistrust, and short-sightedness tore America apart. Welcome to the first episode of the American Civil War, where we will cover the lead-up to the most infamous conflict in United States history. This video is sponsored by our YouTube.
Okay, hold on. That first episode, okay. Interesting.
The Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal, but reality was quite different. While many states didn't actively practice or encourage slavery in 1776, it was legal in all 13 of them. This dissonance between their high-minded Enlightenment ideals and slavery gnawed at America's founders. George Washington's experience was instructive. While he publicly opposed the slave trade for decades, he only denounced slavery itself and his participation in it privately. He was acutely aware of how influential he was and knew that his opposition could doom the institution, but he was more afraid that it could doom the country.
Wow.
Washington fully agreed with Thomas Jefferson's assessment that slavery was the greatest threat to the new nation's unity, as well as a terrible evil that eroded the moral character of humanity. However, Washington knew that his contemporaries would never willingly end slavery outright, and he considered America too fragile to survive that confrontation. State factionalism nearly ripped apart the Continental Army, paralyzed the Continental and Confederation Congress, nearly derailed the Constitutional Convention, and finally caused bitter congressional fights during his presidency. Ultimately, on the topic of slavery, Washington feared that speaking out would break his country.
Wow, that's quite an interesting one or interesting history to check. I think I've also seen another video that talked about the Civil War, the American Civil War as well. So we're also going to check that because, to compare both sides, because obviously one part might go in depth, another part might not also go in depth. But I love this, obviously.
Instead, Washington hoped that his neighbors would realize that slavery was not only immoral, but unsustainably unprofitable, as he had. Washington inherited Mount Vernon at 11, and his decades of meticulous bookkeeping clearly showed that his plantation was failing. Crop yields fell every year, as tobacco depleted the soil. Tobacco's price declined repeatedly due to increasing production and changing global demand. George Washington took great pride in maintaining and treating his slaves better than his neighbors, at great expense. But he'd calculated that even if he spent the barest minimum on their maintenance, he'd still be losing money. The plantation system was a money pit. Washington first wrote about ceasing being a slave owner in 1778. However, it wasn't possible. Virginia only allowed manumission by special act of the legislature, which was rarely done. This left no option but to sell his 123 slaves, to which he was adamantly opposed, writing in 1794, "Were it not then that I am principled against selling Negroes, as one would do cattle in the market, I would not in 12 months from this date be possessed of one as a slave." Therefore, he continuously, though privately, pushed for legislative action to end slavery, writing in 1786, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for this abolition of slavery, but there is only one proper and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority."
Okay.
Jefferson didn't have Washington's inhibitions and publicly worked against slavery, despite being a slave owner himself. In this, he was joined by Benjamin Franklin, a founding member of America's first abolitionist society. Their first victory came in 1778, when Virginia banned importing slaves, a bill Jefferson probably authored. Jefferson further helped pass a 1782 law allowing emancipation by will or deed, probably at Washington's urging. Washington would subsequently free his slaves upon his death, intending to set an example in death as in life.
Wow. Wow.
In 1780, Pennsylvania adopted gradual emancipation and banned further slave imports. Shortly thereafter,
Pennsylvania was the first? Pennsylvania was the first?
Adopted gradual emancipation and banned further slave
imports
to set an example in death as in life. In 1780, Pennsylvania adopted gradual emancipation and banned further slave imports. Shortly thereafter, Massachusetts wrote a new constitution immediately banning slavery in all forms. By 1787, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut were also free states. Meanwhile, the Northwest Ordinance forbade slavery in the Northwest Territory. By 1804, all states north of the Mason-Dixon line had either outright banned slavery or adopted gradual emancipation laws. The climax of this anti-slavery push came in 1807, when Congress banned the international slave trade effective January 1, 1808, the earliest it was constitutionally allowed to do so. However, there was opposition. Virginia's John Randolph warned during debate that the ban would provide a pretext to eliminate slavery entirely, and predicted that the Union would eventually fracture along slave state versus free state lines. At the time, many scoffed at Randolph's prediction. Slavery was declining. While most of the nation's leaders were slave owners, they had the good sense to be ashamed of it. More importantly, many plantation owners discovered that Washington's economic conclusions were correct and followed his manumission example. However, that decline was reversing. In England, the Industrial Revolution was building steam. A series of inventions had mechanized textile production during the late 18th century, and the industry was rapidly growing. This fueled growing demand for raw material to feed the looms, particularly cotton. Britain already had access to cotton production in India and Egypt, but products from those faraway regions tended to spoil on the long voyage to England. European politics plus Mediterranean trade economics made Egyptian imports expensive, slow, and unreliable. It was much faster, safer, and cheaper to import from America.
Wow. It was faster, cheaper, economical to import cotton. Of course, because when you look at it from the map, it's kind of like here, and then India is like round. Okay.
While the full impact of industrialization wouldn't be felt in Britain until the 1830s, by the late 1810s, Eli Whitney's cotton gin had revolutionized cotton production and subsequently saved American slavery. Once the petty Gulf strain was developed, production exploded. This change saved the finances of the remaining Revolution-era planters, but largely didn't change their attitudes towards slavery. They'd never known slavery as anything but a declining institution and a necessary evil. This revival in their closing years was too little too late. However, their sons and grandsons came to the opposite conclusion. For them, slavery led to great wealth, limitless growth, and economic stability. Every recession and financial crisis in the 19th century passed their plantations by while hammering the North. Thus, they broke with their forefathers and began to actively defend slavery. Gradually, the rhetoric of necessary evil disappeared, ultimately replaced with arguments of slavery being a positive good, frequently with religious tones. While the oldest generation retained power through the early 1820s, tensions were muted. However, by the 1830s, the younger generations began to rapidly raise the temperature.
And mind you, this 1810, 1808 and stuff, America, I think 1812 to 1815, right? America was also at war with Britain as at that time, right? In fact, lots of things were going on.
Meanwhile, gradual abolition meant that former slaves needed to be integrated into society. Many whites believed this was impossible and undesirable, and so a different solution was sought. Their thinking was that since emancipated slaves and other free people of color's African ancestors hadn't willingly emigrated to the United States, they'd be happier going to their so-called homelands. The American Colonization Society was founded to, quote-unquote, help African Americans return to Africa. The ACS established the colony of Liberia in 1822, which became an invaluable haven for those rescued from the slave trade. However, only a few thousand African Americans ever emigrated, as most strongly opposed the ACS's mission. With most African Americans having been born and raised in the United States, America was their home, not Africa.
Exactly.
At the same time, westward expansion began forcing the slavery issue. The Northwest Ordinance ensured that America's post-revolution territory would ultimately be half slave and half free states, a balance that ensured neither side could force its will on the other. However, that did not extend to the Louisiana Purchase or Oregon Country. In fact, there was absolutely no settlement plan in place for either territory, and Congress had run out of time to make one. In 1818, Missouri petitioned for admittance as a slave state, the first new state west of the Mississippi. This set off a bitter debate in Congress, as it upset the planned balance and finally forced the slavery issue to the forefront. The Democratic-Republican Party began to split along regional lines, as Northern Republicans objected to extending slavery on moral grounds, and Southern Republicans rejected federal action on slavery on constitutionally guaranteed states' rights. This debate remained deadlocked until Maine petitioned for admittance as a free state in 1820. This enabled Kentucky Senator Henry Clay to broker a compromise. Missouri would enter as a slave state, balanced by Maine entering free. Thereafter, slavery would be allowed in new states south of Missouri's southern border and banned above it. Both sides found this acceptable, as the Western Territory wasn't suitable for plantation farming. However, as the generational changeover began, the compromise would be questioned. While Southerners were pleased that efforts to completely ban slavery in the West failed, their share of the Louisiana Purchase was minuscule compared to the territory designated free. They'd soon question the wisdom of the compromise and look toward territorial acquisition south of the line to fix the imbalance. This would lead to an era of military adventuring known as filibustering, where American mercenaries sought to seize Caribbean islands and Latin American countries to become new slave states.
Wow.
With the compromise in place, slavery moved to the back burner, but regionalist conflict still led to a major blow-up between the states. By 1820, the American Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and the new manufacturers were begging Congress for protection against established and cheaper manufactured goods from England. Concurrently, the western states wanted federal help building needed roads, canals, and other internal infrastructure. Thus, new and stronger protectionist tariffs were floated to raise funds for infrastructure projects. However, southern agricultural exports were heavily affected by tariffs already, leading to vehement southern opposition to more protectionism. Thus, a cabal of southern congressmen concocted a political ploy to permanently defeat protectionism. The Mid-Atlantic and Western congressmen would support any tariff increase, while the South would oppose any tariff. New England was more variable, and thus the target of the ploy. Thus, the cabal drafted the sympathetic Martin Van Buren from New York to draft a tariff bill that was guaranteed to fail by taxing New England's material imports. With Southerners co-sponsoring the bill, they'd appear conciliatory. When New England opposed the bill, the South would withdraw support, killing the bill. New England would take the blame, and any future protectionist tariffs would be dead on arrival thanks to the lesson of this abominable bill.
Wow.
However, the Southern congressmen were horrified when enough New England congressmen and senators accepted that a tariff was better than no tariff and voted it into law. The plot had completely backfired. 1828 was an election year, and President John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts lost to Tennessee's Andrew Jackson. Southerners hoped Jackson would repeal that tariff of abominations, but he refused. The tariff was perfectly constitutional, and he wasn't going to rescue them from their own stupidity. This caused
Okay. Now it gets all the more interesting.
repeal that tariff of abominations, but he refused. The tariff was perfectly constitutional, and he wasn't going to rescue them from their own stupidity. This caused a very public blow-up with Vice President John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, which only served to harden the president's position.
Wow.
The tariff lasted until 1832, and despite predictions, didn't actually crush the southern economy, as the price of cotton rose faster than the tariff rates. However, nobody likes taxes, and the lost potential profit cut deeply into the planter's psyche. In 1832, tariff rates were reduced, but not to South Carolina's satisfaction, and at Calhoun's urging, a special convention declared that the tariff was unconstitutional and could not be enforced in South Carolina, and the state would secede from the Union if anyone tried. Nullification and secession was first floated in 1798 by Jefferson and James Madison in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. However, as these ideas flew in the face of the Constitution's Supremacy Clause and fundamentally undermined the concept of central governance, the Supreme Court would gradually rule against most of their arguments. They'd been revived in 1814 over the War of 1812, but its conclusion completely delegitimized both concepts. Calhoun and his allies revived the ideas again to protect their home state's interests. This plan quickly slammed into an immovable object named Andrew Jackson. Despite being a proud Southern slave owner, he was a staunch Unionist and conflated.
Let me pause here. Because to say the state's interest, I was about to say, is it to protect the state's interest or to protect their business? Because it's not giving like it's to protect the state's business interests. It's giving business, their business.
Supreme Court would gradually rule against most of their arguments. They'd been revived in 1814 over the War of 1812, but its conclusion completely delegitimized both concepts. Calhoun and his allies revived the ideas again to protect their home state's interests. This plan quickly slammed into an immovable object named Andrew Jackson. Despite being a proud Southern slave owner, he was a staunch Unionist and conflated nullification with treason. An enraged Jackson threatened to enforce the tariff by raising an army, leading it to Charleston and personally hanging nullification's supporters. Finding that no other state publicly supported them, and knowing that Jackson never made an idle threat, South Carolina delayed implementation until Henry Clay brokered another compromise with Jackson's approval. On February 25th, Congress passed the Force Bill, enabling Jackson to use military force to enforce the law, alongside the compromise tariff, which would reduce and equalize tariff rates over the next 10 years. With its face saved, South Carolina withdrew its nullification threat. However, Jackson predicted that the tariff was only a pretext, and disunion and Southern Confederacy the real object. The next pretext will be the Negro, or slavery question. Over the next 17 years, the pressure continued to build. Southern politicians used their influence to institute gag rules, preventing congressional debate on slavery, and kept anti-slavery candidates from the presidency. While Northern politicians raged against slave power's domination of politics, their complaints went nowhere. The average non-Cotton Belt American neither knew nor cared enough about slavery to be concerned, so long as it didn't affect them. The horrors of Deep South plantations were obscured by the idyllic image model plantations in the Upper South created. America's Abolition Society's efforts to change this attitude went nowhere. Despite victories like the Amistad decision, abolitionists found themselves on the outs politically, and not just because of slave power. Abolitionist newspapers and speakers were attacked by Northern mobs, not from pro-slavery attitudes but annoyance. Most Northerners weren't keen on black people being equals in society, and they really hated self-righteous lecturing over slavery. Meanwhile, the Western push continued. Texas was annexed in 1845, and the subsequent Mexican-American War won additional territory. Again, the lion's share of the new territory was above the Missouri Compromise line, causing Southern discontent. California's petition to enter the Union as a free state caused this resentment to explode. Southerners objected that Southern California was under the Compromise line and should therefore be broken off as a slave state. However, California's legislature made it clear that it would not accept any division, and Congress couldn't risk losing California's gold. The South complained about this being grossly unfair to them and that it threatened the slave-free state balance. Facing another deadlock, Clay stepped in to broker his final grand compromise, using California to help solve a number of issues. The Compromise of 1850 solved Texas's border disputes, created the New Mexico and Utah territories, allowed those two territories to determine for themselves if slavery would be legal, outlawed the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and critically admitted California as a free state in exchange for a new Fugitive Slave Act.
Can you imagine?
Popular sovereignty, as the new territorial policy was called, partially overrode the Missouri Compromise, which had been seen as a victory by both sides. Both territories could potentially become free or slave states. However, that fact was largely lost in the outrage caused by the new Fugitive Slave Act. The current fugitive slave law from 1793 was toothless. Most free states required actual court proceedings before allowing alleged escapees to be extradited, as with any crime. As proof of enslavement was frequently non-existent, few slaves were ever returned. There were no penalties for non-compliance or assisting escaped slaves, so it was impossible to enforce. Therefore, federal officials rarely bothered trying. The compromise.
Wow, a lot to unpack here. That's why I always say to learn history, right? To learn history because there's a lot of things, or there are a lot of things that actually happened in history, regardless. There's somewhere nice, somewhere aren't. But still, it's always good to learn history.
Therefore, federal officials rarely bothered trying. The compromise finally gave slave owners the stronger law they'd been demanding for decades.
Free.
Now, federal officials were required to actively hunt down escapees or be heavily fined. There were also financial rewards for bringing in an escaped slave.
Oh!
The only evidence required or allowed was the slave owner's testimony, and the accused wasn't allowed to speak in their defense. Moreover, citizens were required under penalty of fines or imprisonment to report escaping slaves and assist officials in their capture. The act outraged all sectors of Northern society. Northern judges and law enforcement were outraged at the lack of habeas corpus protections, which led to numerous free blacks being kidnapped into slavery. The politicians were angered at their states' rights being trampled, despite Southerners constantly citing states' rights to defend slavery. However, common citizens were the most outraged. Prior to 1850, they were apathetic at best towards slavery. It didn't affect them. The act turned that apathy into righteous indignation and rage. How dare Southerners involve them in their peculiar institution? The more they were forced to learn about slavery, the more they detested it, a process accelerated in 1852 by Uncle Tom's Cabin. The slave owners had barely finished toasting their victory when shocking news of Northern resistance arrived. Vermont effectively nullified the act by requiring a judicial process before extradition of accused slaves, and refused to back down when threatened by President Millard Fillmore. Slave catchers were attacked by mobs, and jails were stormed to free captured slaves. Moreover, juries acquitted anyone tried for aiding escaped slaves. Despite rhetoric painting all Northerners as abolitionist agitators for years, most Southern politicians were aware of abolition's unpopularity. They'd hoped that Northern apathy concealed a secret enthusiasm for slavery, and that the act would push them to support it openly. They could not have been more wrong, and now reality matched their rhetoric. To their horror, the South had created the very opposition they'd always imagined, and had to face an increasingly hostile North. The countdown to the American Civil War began in 1854. Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas was apathetic about slavery, but cared deeply about railroads. He wanted a transcontinental railroad, and he wanted Chicago to be its origin. However, Southern senators were blocking all legislation organizing the territory west of Missouri. The Missouri Compromise guaranteed that the remaining unorganized territory would become free states, and that was now anathema. Without organization, there could be no development, and consequently no railway. Therefore, Douglas made a deal. In exchange for organizing Kansas and Nebraska territories, the Missouri Compromise would be replaced by popular sovereignty. However, Douglas didn't realize that the Kansas-Nebraska Act would unleash the 70 years of pent-up tension. Join us next time as Bleeding Kansas opens a wound that will drown a nation. If you don't want to miss that and many other historical videos, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Recently, we
Interesting. I would love to check the other part of the video. But again, I always preach and say to check history, right? History, check it for your own good, because this is an eye opener. Regardless of how you want to think or how you want to say it, history happened. There were some good things and some bad things, obviously. And learning from a neutral base would clear the way to for you to understand or have a full understanding of what actually happened now. I'm looking forward to checking the other parts of it. This is the road to the war, so obviously the other part would be the actual war, what happened, and all that. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Obviously, it's giving um personal interest, business gain, and whatever over the vast majority, because people will be like, oh, this is profitable for their business, so they're not going to lose it, right? But again, this is interesting to learn about. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and all that stuff. And until next time, see you in the next video.